everybody, welcome to week 7. This week we'll be using several chapters to talk about Darwin, evolution, and including macroevolution and microevolution. So Charles Darwin was 22 years old in 1831, and this is when he went aboard the HMS Beagle. His voyage lasted 5 years, and he went along the southern hemisphere. His mission was to expand the Navy's knowledge of natural resources like food and water in foreign lands. Observation through his 5-year trip led Darwin to come up with the theory of evolution, which was contrary to the beliefs at the time. So here's the map that shows the journey of the HMS Beagle around the world. The journey took 5 years to complete, and upon Darwin's observations of the animals he encountered, he hypothesized that all the animals are related and do change over time. One of his noted observations was that a rhea, that is native to South America, looks very similar to an ostrich that was native to Africa. So as Darwin was coming up with his theory of evolution, people had an entirely different way of viewing the world. Instead, they thought that the world was about 6,000 years old and that animals do not change over time, but in fact has stayed the same since they were created. However, about this time, explorers were bringing back fossils and found in different strata of rock, which led them to think that the Earth was actually older than 6,000 years. George Cuvier is the founder of paleontology, which means the study of fossils. He didn't believe that animals change over time, so he hypothesized that a catastrophe started each new strata. And one strata is one layer of rock inside a cliff or a mountain. So the different fossils in the strata were the animals that lived on the land at the time, and this theory is called catastrophism. So the above diagram shows how water takes sediments into the sea. The sediments then become compacted to form a stratum, or strata for plural. A stratum is a layer of rock or soil that is consistent in character and is generally about the same color. These characteristics help to distinguish the different strata from each other, and as a result of later geological upheaval, the strata may be located on the land. This theory is further confirmed by the finding of a marine animal called a trilobite, which was found on land after it had been fossilized. So due to erosion, it is often possible to see a number of strata. The strata in this picture are pretty obvious because of the varying colors in brown, red, and tan. Each of the stratum could potentially contain fossils, with the oldest fossils being on the lowest stratum. So another naturalist at the time of Darwin was also coming up with his own version of evolution, and his name is John Baptiste de Lamarck. And after observing the fossils in each strata, Lamarck hypothesized that animals change over time from simple organisms to complex organisms through adaptation. To explain the concept of adaptation to an organism's environment, Lamarck proposed the idea of the inheritance of traits, in which the use and disuse of a structure can bring about inherited changes. The example he gave to support his theory was that a giraffe has a long neck because it kept stretching to the top of the tree to grab food. Over time, offspring of the giraffes acquired longer and longer necks. Modern genetics, however, disproves this theory. For example, if someone is blinded in a car accident or works out a lot and has large muscles, these traits will not be passed on to their children. So the only mutations that can be passed on to the children are those that can happen within the gametes, including the sperm and the egg. So Darwin's ideas were very close to Lamarck's, but there was a couple of differences. Darwin's ideas included that the species are suited to the environment through no will of their own, and that natural selection is the means for speciation. So Darwin's conclusions are based on three main factors, including geology, fossils, and biogeography. During Darwin's time on HMS Beagle, he read this book called The Principles of Geology by Charles Lyell. And in this book, it said that the Earth was very old and that stratas occurred through a cycle of both erosion and uplift. From this, Darwin concluded that the Earth was pretty old, and it was able to support his theory of evolution, since it would take a long time for animals to evolve. Also during his trip, Darwin collected fossils during his voyage, and he was able to find pretty simple fossils and very complex fossils. And from this, he concluded that species are not fixed over time, but instead will change as the environment changes. So Darwin had already hypothesized that animals adapted to their environment, and another example that further confirmed his theory was the similarity between the Patagonian hare and the European rabbit. Because the Patagonian hare looked so different from the rabbit, but had similar adaptations of long legs and long ears, he hypothesized that those who aren't related could still have similar characteristics because they have adapted to similar environments. And this is called convergent evolution. So on the left-hand side, you'll have the Patagonian hare, and it is a relatively large rodent with the face of a guinea pig. And on the right-hand side, you'll have the European rabbit. So Darwin hypothesized that these two looked alike, not because of them being related through evolutionary means, but because they adapted to similar environments. So as Darwin was traveling, he happened upon the Galapagos Islands, which is just off the west coast of South America. He noticed that the animals here were also similar to the ones on the mainland, but there were some small differences. So he mainly focused on some birds called finches. And on the Galapagos Islands, there was a wide variety of finches, including ground-dwelling and tree-dwelling finches. Each finch had a unique beak for the type of food they ate. Darwin hypothesized that these finches descended from the finches on the mainland, and the evolution of new species from one is called speciation. Darwin hypothesized that speciation happens when a couple of animals from one species is separated from the rest, and that they then adapt to that new environment. So here are a couple of the finches that Darwin had looked at. The ground-dwelling finch has a large beak that allows it to open up large seeds. The woodpecker finch has a thin beak that allows it to use tools to get insects in both holes and crevices. And then the cactus finch has a long, somewhat decurved beak and a split tongue that allows it to probe cactus for cacti flowers for nectar. So just like the finches, the tortoises varied on the Galapagos Islands based on their diet. Long-necked tortoises were found in dry areas with food scarcity. They were able to reach the food found in the tall cacti. Short-necked tortoises were more common in environments where the food on the ground was more abundant. Darwin noted that these adaptations and defined an adaptation as a characteristic that makes an organism more suited to its environment. So the observation of the tortoises and the finches led Darwin to come up with his hypothesis of natural selection, in which it requires members of a population to have a high genetic diversity. More offspring is to be produced per generation that can be supported. Individuals with favorable traits survive and reproduce more than those who are lacking the traits. And then across generations, a larger proportion of the population will possess the favorable traits as opposed to the unfavorable traits. So natural selection requires that a population has a high genetic diversity. Natural selection is not genetic mutation. Instead, natural selection will work with mutations that have already happened in the genome. Natural selection is not some God directing the evolution of the animals. Instead, it is the adaptation of the organism to its environment without the regard of the future needs of the organism. So in other words, natural selection is going to be random. And an adaptation is only advantageous if it helps the organism survive in its current environment, as with the many coloration of tree snails shown in the picture off to the right. So in this example of the snails, predators are likely to eat the tree snails with the white shell because they pop out more easily. The tree snails with the black shell are more likely to reproduce since they hide a lot better, and so the predators won't eat them as often. So before Darwin, mutations were considered imperfections and ignored, like animals that had albinism. However, Darwin saw the mutations as further proof of his natural selection theory, even essential to it, because these variations meant that there were a lot of different genes for natural selection to work on, and so allows animals to adapt to changes in their environment. In Darwin's mind, if animals didn't change over time, then these variations wouldn't exist. So in this picture here, we are comparing Darwin's natural theory of natural selection and Lamarck's theory of acquired traits. On the right-hand side, we have a giraffe population with varying sizes of neck, and the food is all in really tall trees. The giraffes with the longer necks are able to reach the food in the trees, and so because they are able to get more food, they are the ones that will end up reproducing, and the short-necked giraffes will end up dying. Eventually, as the long-necked giraffes continue to reproduce, eventually we'll have an entire population of long-necked giraffes. In Lamarck's theory of acquired traits, we will start off with all short-necked giraffes, and as they reach for the food in the tall trees, eventually their necks will be much longer. So here's another scientist that contributed a little to Darwin's theory. Thomas Malthus noted that an environment with a limited number of resources could only hold a certain number of organisms, and that the organisms fight to get limited resources. We learned about this a couple weeks ago, and this limit is called carrying capacity. Darwin applied this to his theory, and he called it fitness. And fitness is defined as the reproductive success of an individual relative to the members of the population. And this is determined by comparing the number of surviving fertile offspring, which is produced by each member of the population. And the most fit individuals capture the most resources and then convert it into a larger number of viable offsprings, which will then determine the fitness of the various species or the various individuals for the populations. And in nature, the animal's fitness will be determined by the interaction with its environment. So this picture here depicts the trends in jellyfish populations around the world. Red means an increase with a high certainty. Orange means an increase with low certainty. Green means a stable/variable population. Blue means a decrease in population. And then gray means no data. Circles represent specific recordings of the population, with the size of the circle representing the confidence level of the conclusion. Overall, the jellyfish populations are decreasing around the world. Lucas Bratz, a researcher at the University of British Columbia, says that jellyfish got the unique life cycle where they are able to tolerate harsh conditions and then rapidly reproduce when the conditions are favorable again. So when a stressor like climate change or overfishing will open up an environment for them to reproduce, they are able to take advantage of that and reproduce really quickly. So not all species of jellyfish are this fit. Rather, there tends to be a few species that rapidly increase, but the other species don't. This then causes a reduction in the diversity of jellyfish. So in 1836, Charles Darwin finally returned to Britain after his 5-year-long journey on the HMS Beagle. For the next 20 years, he continued to work on his theory of evolution, which he was able to put together within a book called The Origin of Species. He decided to publish after another scientist named Alfred Russel Wallace also came up with a similar idea. He's the one that came up with the idea of survival of the fittest. And they were able to present a joint paper to the Linnaean Society. Darwin presented his book on the origin of species, and Wallace was able then to present his book. And then together they announced to the world of the theory of evolution. All right, so now we'll move on to chapter 15 and talk about microevolution. So natural selection is the process by which a population of animals or plants will evolve to the living and non-living environments. The natural selection is Darwin's mechanism for evolution. The more fit individuals become more prevalent in a population. And just to recap, fitness means that an animal or plant contains some type of characteristics that will get them more habitat and more food. And then eventually these new adaptations will lead to change in a population over time. And the most fit individuals will be able to reproduce, or the ones that will be able to reproduce more often, generally because they can get more food and habitat to live in. Evolution by natural selection needs three things. It needs a high genetic diversity. The members this means that there's just a lot of alleles in the population. For example, there would be alleles for green eyes, blue eyes, brown eyes, hazel eyes, while a population with a low genetic diversity would only have an allele for brown eyes. It needs inheritance, which means many of these differences are going to be inheritable or can be passed on from one generation to the next. And then these adaptations are going to need to increase the fitness of the offspring. And this means that the offspring will be better adapted to their environment and will be more likely to reproduce and have fertile offspring. So eventually the genes in the fit animals will become the more prevalent genes in the population. So there are three types of natural selection, and there's directional selection, stabilizing selection, and disruptive selection. All of these can be represented by a bell curve graph, which we'll see what that looks like on the upcoming slides. So a few weeks ago we talked about polygenic traits, and that a polygenic polygenic traits means that one physical trait will be controlled by multiple genes instead of just one gene. And these polygenic traits can also be represented on a bell curve and will be influenced by these three different types of natural selection. So here we have the three different types of natural selection represented by bell curves. And just a quick explanation, a bell curve is called so because it's kind of shaped like a bell. And I forget the exact percentages, but basically the majority of a population will have a physical trait that is found in the center here, which is why it is so tall in the middle. While very few people will have the extreme physical traits that could be found in a trait, meaning that very few people will have blue eyes, and there may be very few people that would have red eyes, for example. So with stabilizing selection, those extreme phenotypes, so like the blue eyes and the red eyes, will end up disappearing from a human population, and eventually that average phenotype, which let's say brown eyes, will increase in the population. With directional selection, one of the extreme phenotypes will end up increasing in population and increasing in number, and the other extreme phenotype will disappear from a population, and the average phenotype will decrease in a population. So for example, blue eyes, one of the extreme phenotypes, will drastically increase in number in our animal population, as demonstrated by the taller part of our bell curve. Notice how the average phenotype, so let's say our brown eyes, has drastically decreased in number. Although there's going to be still some people that will have brown eyes in our animal population. But notice too that our people with red eyes have disappeared from the population. So these genes for red eyes no longer exist. And then in disruptive selection, the average phenotype will greatly decrease in number. So the people with brown eyes are going to greatly decrease in number. And the two extreme phenotypes, so like blue and red eyes, will greatly increase in number. So with stabilizing selection, it occurs with an intermediate phenotype as it increases in frequency. And the intermediate phenotype is the average phenotype that I was talking about on the previous slide, or the people with brown eyes. The extreme phenotypes will decrease, so the people with red eyes and blue eyes will decrease. And this is the most common form of selection because it is the average individual that will be most adapted or most well adapted to its environment. For example, Swiss starlings lay 4 to 5 eggs because this method has the highest survival rate for their young. Going from our example, most Swiss starlings will lay between 4 to 5 eggs, and a few other starlings will lay either 1 to 3 or 6 and above eggs. The baby birds in the clutches with 4 to 5 eggs tend to live longer than the young that are found in the clutch with 2 eggs. As a result, more of these young grow up, and they have an average clutch size as well. They are passing along the genes of average clutch size, and they increase in number in comparison to the birds with the genes of the smaller clutch size. So directional selection occurs when an extreme phenotype is favored. So either if the blue eyes or the red eyes allows a population to be better suited to its environment. So the bell curve will shift either far to the right or far to the left. And this can occur in a population when there's an extreme change in the environment. Some examples include drug resistance in bacteria, like MRSA, methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus, pesticide resistance in insects, malaria, also called Plasmodium, becoming more resistant to medication like chloroquine, or mosquitoes being more resistant to insecticide. And then the genus Quis, which include horses, donkeys, and zebras, are adapting more to grassland environments than from forest environments. So scientists have recently found that more African elephants are being born with smaller tusks. So this is going to be an example of directional selection. And this is unfortunately because poachers are killing the elephants with the larger tusks, which only leaves elephants with the smaller tusks to reproduce and increase in number. And then we have disruptive selection. And this is when two or more of the extreme phenotypes are favored over that average phenotype. So, for example, the people with red and blue eyes will greatly increase in number, and the people with brown eyes will greatly decrease in number. An example of this is the British land snails that are found in fields and in forests. In fields, the thrushes eat the snails with the dark shells that do not have the light bands. And in forests, thrushes feed mainly on small snails with light banded shells. So in this example, the two extreme phenotypes are variable in their approximate environments. The snails with the faded shells are able to hide from the thrushes easier in the trees than and able to increase in number. The snails with the shells that have bright bands can better hide in the fields, and this is where they increase in number. So over time, you lose the snails with the opposite phenotype in each environment. Therefore, you will end up with two distinct bell curves. So natural selection needs a high genetic diversity, and so there is always, and because of this, we're always going to find at least some genetic diversity in our animal populations. Populations with limited genetic diversity may not be able to adapt to the changing environments. And there are several different factors that are promoting genetic diversity in the populations. This includes mutations, recombination of DNA, independent assortment of genes into the various sperm and eggs, and random fertilization of random sperm into eggs. We also have gene flow, which is when different species populations mate with each other. And this means that like a raccoon from the Fort Wayne population will go up to Detroit, Michigan and mate with a raccoon around there. And then we also have the certain phenotypes or certain characteristics of genes that also promote genetic diversity. And this includes diploidy, which means that there's going to be two sets of genes in a cell, and then the heterozygote, which means those genes that may not be favorable at the moment could still remain in a population, just in case it may be favorable to that population at a later date, or at a later time frame when the environment changes. So the heterozygote advantage is when dominant alleles and homozygous recessive genes are subject to changes in the environment. And the good thing about heterozygotes, again, that it can protect those genes that may not be favorable to the population at the time, which most of the time will be the recessive alleles. And recessive alleles may not be favorable to the population at the time, but may be so at a later date. And when it is, then that recessive gene will end up increasing in population, since it's favorable to the population at that time. When both recessive and dominant alleles are maintained, it is called balanced polymorphism. And this is when natural selection favors the ratio of 2 or more phenotypes in one generation and the generations after that. And we can see this in sickle cell disease. So individuals who are homozygous recessive for sickle cell disease tend to die early. Individuals who are heterozygotes for this trait have normal shaped red blood cells, unless the oxygen levels in their blood get low, in which the blood cells sickle. The homozygous dominant phenotype is normally the most healthy, as our red blood cells stay circular no matter what the concentration of the blood. Ironically, though, the recessive allele has a higher frequency in Africa, where malaria is prevalent. And malaria is a type of disease that is transmitted by insects from the Plasmodium species. And this insect will invade the human and destroy their cells. The Plasmodium parasites that was transmitted by the mosquito are unable to live in heterozygotes because the infection decreased the oxygen level of the blood, which caused the red blood cell to sickle. The parasites are not able to live in these sickled cells, and so the parasite dies. Heterozygotes are able to fight off the malaria infection and then live on to pass their genetics. So in this case, the homozygotes will decrease in number due to malaria and sickle cell. However, these genes are still maintained since the heterozygotes contain both alleles. This is a good example of why genetic diversity is so important to the health of a species. So on whole, individuals do not evolve. One's gene expression may change over one's lifetime, such as getting darker skin in the sun or increasing the amount of muscles they have. However, because the sunburned skin or the increase in muscle cannot be passed on to their children, these changes are not going to be inheritable to the children. Therefore, we say that populations evolve as gene flows from one generation to the next. A population is all the members of a species occupying an area and reproducing with one another. The flow of genes and any changes in the gene frequency is called microevolution. All the alleles of genes within a population is called that population's gene pool. It is characterized by the percentage of the different genotypes and alleles. For example, the 3 possible genotypes here are homozygous dominant, which are the black moths, heterozygous, which are also black since they contain that one dominant allele, and then white moths, which are homozygous recessive since they contain 2 recessive alleles. In our first generation, 4% of our moths contain the homozygous dominant genotype, 32% have the heterozygous genotype, and then 64% has the homozygous recessive phenotype. This allows us to determine the allele frequency, which is 20% have the dominant allele and 80% has the recessive allele. So there was changes in the allele frequency of the moth population because of the Industrial Revolution. So before the Industrial Revolution, the bark on the trees were a lot lighter. And so birds were not able to see the light peppered moths, and so therefore more of them existed in the moth population. As the bark darkened due to the pollution, this resulted in birds being able to see the white pepper moths a lot better than the black ones. And this caused the white moths to decrease in number and the black moths to increase in number. So therefore the allele frequency changed. The dominant allele from our black peppered moths greatly increased in number, and the recessive allele from the white peppered moths decreased in number. Because of the allele frequency change, the genotype frequency also changed. But there are 2 other scientists that kind of have a different view of the change in alleles within a population over time. And these guys' names are G.H. Hardy and W. Weinberg. They came up with this theorem to calculate the allele and genotype frequencies of a population. So and the equation that they came up with is p squared plus 2pq plus q squared equals 1. P is the frequency of the dominant alleles, and q equals the frequency of the recessive alleles. So p squared is our homozygous dominant genotype, 2pq are the heterozygous genotypes, and then q squared are the homozygous recessive genotype. And then 1 is going to be 100% of the population. So your values for p squared, 2pq, and q squared are all going to be decimals. And when you add them together, they should all equal 1. So in our peppered moth example, the uppercase D is the dark color, and the lowercase d is the light color. So from the genotype frequencies, you can then calculate the allele frequencies of a population. So in this Punnett square, it is going to be for the entire moth population instead of just 2 individuals. The genotype frequencies are 4% homozygous dominant, 32% heterozygous, and 64% homozygous recessive. So the allele frequencies are going to be 0.2 of our recessive allele and 0.8 of the dominant allele. So if we use the available alleles in our F1 generation, which are going to be the offspring of our parent generation, then we can make a Punnett square to see what the results will be in the F2 generation, or the offspring of the F1 generation. After we've done our calculation, the results show that with random mating, allele frequencies do not change from one generation to the next. So pretty much the amount of alleles in each generation should be about the same. So this shows that the allele frequencies will remain over the time, and that sexual selection alone does not bring about a change in allele frequencies. This also shows us that dominance does not cause an allele to become a common allele, as the recessive allele was 80%. So the Hardy-Weinberg principle states that there will be an equilibrium of allele frequencies in a gene pool, and that they will remain the same from one generation to the next. And in order to get these results, we need to have 5 different conditions. There needs to be no mutations in the DNA. There needs to be no gene flow in and out of a population, meaning that the members of a population will only mate with each other. There needs to be a random mating, which just means each individual has an equal opportunity of reproducing. There needs to be no genetic drift, which means that there is, which is an event causing a change in allele frequencies. And then there is going to be no selection, which just means that there is going to be no environmental change, causing different alleles to be in favor or out of favor. So these 5 conditions are not met very often in wild populations, as the alleles frequencies do change over time. So therefore microevolution occurs. However, the Hardy-Weinberg equation can still be significant because it can tell us factors that could cause microevolution. Evolution can be detected and measured by the amount of deviation from the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium of allele frequencies in a gene pool of a population. So by noting the changes in the allele frequency of our peppered moths, we know that some type of microevolution has occurred. By noting the changes in the environment, we can tell what were causing the changes in the allele frequencies. So the pollution caused by the Industrial Revolution caused a type of genetic drift, which caused a drastic change in the allele frequency in just a short period of time. This shows us that microevolution can occur over a short time frame. So just like there are conditions for the Hardy-Weinberg theorem, there are going to be conditions of microevolution, or things that cause microevolution. This includes genetic mutation, so this means that there's going to be mutations in our DNA. There is gene flow, which just means that individuals of one population are going to mate with the individuals from another population. There's going to be non-random mating, which means some individuals of a population are more likely to reproduce than those of other individuals in that population. There will be genetic drift, so there will be changes in the environment, and then there will be natural selection. So genetic mutations are going to be the ultimate source of allele differences. Without mutations, there would be no new variations among the members of a population for natural selection to act on. The adaptive value of any mutation is going to be determined by the environment that gene is going to be found in. And most mutations have no harmful effect on the species. For example, the water flea Daphnia ordinarily thrives in water that is 20 degrees Celsius. However, there is a mutation that requires Daphnia to live between 25 and 30 degrees Celsius. As the harmfulness of this mutation will depend on which environment the flea lives in. So gene flow is the movement of alleles among species populations by the migration of breeding animals. So, for example, a raccoon from Fort Wayne going to Detroit to mate with a raccoon in Detroit. This can cause variations within a population by introducing new alleles from one to another. Continued gene flow will reduce genetic differences between populations. For example, for a long time, zoos readily bred Sumatran and Bornean orangutans together. This introduced the novel alleles from each species to the other. If zoos continue to do this, then eventually the two species would become one, since they will all share the same gene pool. Since the zoos do not get new individuals from the wild, zoos stop doing this so that there would still be two species. Now only Sumatran orangutans will breed with each other, and Bornean orangutans will breed with each other. So non-random mating is when individuals in a population will have a greater chance of reproducing than other individuals in the population. Sexual selection happens when a certain trait increases the likelihood of that individual reproducing. And sexual selection is very common in humans and animals. Certain traits are going to be more attractive than others. So birds with the brightest feathers are more likely to mate than the birds with the duller feathers. Assortative mating is when individuals tend to bring a mate with others who look like them. When this occurs, homozygotes increase in number because homozygotes can only produce homozygotes. If two people with blue eyes have children, then all of their children will have blue eyes. So genetic drift refers to the changes in the allele frequencies of the gene pool due to chance, and this is normally due to some type of storm or some type of large change in the environment. So eventually the allele frequencies will drift over time, just depending on which members die, survive, or reproduce. And this is much more likely to happen in small populations, as small populations are going to be much more affected by these changes. The loss of 50 individuals in a small population will have more of an effect on the gene pool than within a larger population. Genetic drift is much more likely to lose those rare alleles, and the common alleles are eventually going to become fixed over time. So in this frog population, We originally started off with 10% of the frog population being dark. After a natural disaster kills 5 of the green frogs, now 20% of the population has that dark phenotype. The dark allele increased by 100%. This shows that small populations are much more subject to genetic drift than larger ones. So something else that can drastically change the allele frequency in a population is called a bottleneck. And this is when a species suffers a near extinction and only leaves a few individuals to continue reproducing. And cheetahs experience this. All cheetahs are closely related, potentially because of a few individuals surviving some type of natural disaster, and inbreeding with each other increase the population. Whatever the natural disaster that occurred, cheetahs suffer from infertility due to the inbreeding that had to occur after the bottleneck. Another type of genetic drift is called the founder effect. An example of this can be seen in the Amish of Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. So they are an isolated group founded by German settlers, and these German settlers were the founders of this population. These German settlers carried a couple of recessive alleles, including the one for dwarfism. Because it was a small population and there was only a few individuals to breed, the frequency of this dwarfism allele greatly increased in number. And so there was a larger number of people with dwarfism than there can be found in the rest of the human population. So generally 1 in 14 of the Amish in this small population will carry the recessive genes, in comparison to 1 in just 1,000 in the rest of the human population. So unlike microevolution, macroevolution occurs over a long period of time, and speciation is the result of this. There are several different definitions of a species. For fossils, scientists will base a species just off their looks. With bacteria, scientists will base the species off the DNA, but most scientists will use the biological species concept. And the biological species concept says that all members of a population need to be able to breed with one another. They need to share a gene pool, and each species are reproductively isolated from every other species. A population of a species can reproduce with each other, but not with the populations of a different species. So the raccoons in Fort Wayne can't mate with the raccoons in Detroit. And species are not going to be based on appearance. For example, flycatchers look very similar, but are going to be different species. And humans can look very different, but we're all the same species. So flycatchers may look similar, but yet do not interbreed within nature. Therefore, they are going to be different species. Humans, on the other hand, may look very different, but we're all a part of the same species. So the biological species concept will only apply to living, sexually reproducing organisms. And there are a couple of other definitions of a species. Within paleontology, it's the fossils that look alike that will be related to each other. Within microbiology, it is the bacteria that will have the same DNA and characteristics that will be the same species. And then within evolution, it is going to be the organisms that are closely related to each other. And evolutionary species are much more likely to affect the genus of a population as it would be the species of a population. So within nature, there are reproductive barriers to keep species mating with one another, and there are prezygotic and postzygotic barriers. And our prezygotic barrier, prezygotic are going to happen before the formation of a zygote. So pretty much before a sperm fertilizes an egg. And the prezygotic barriers include habitat isolation, temporal isolation, behavioral isolation, mechanical isolation, and then gamete isolation. And then postzygotic just means that these barriers are going to happen after the sperm fertilizes the egg. And this includes zygote mortality, hybrid sterility, and then the fitness of the offspring of the F1 generation. So male blue-footed boobies must do a courtship display in order for them to reproduce with the females. They lift their feet to show off the blue colors to the females. If the males do not do this, then the females will not breed with them. And so this is a form of a prezygotic barrier, since reproduction will not happen unless they do this courtship display. So an example of a postzygotic barrier is hybrid sterility. And this is when the offspring of two individuals from a species are not able to produce offspring of their own. So two ligers, which are the offspring between a male lion and a female tiger, will not be able to have offspring of their own. However, after one zoo housed a male lion with a female liger, they actually were able to find out that the female ligers can still carry young. And so they ended up naming the offspring of the lion and the liger liger. So another example of hybrid sterility is when a horse mated with a donkey and produced mules. And farmers quickly found out that mules were not able to produce their own offspring. And mules will be infertile due to a difference in the amount of chromosomes inherited by both parents. So there are a couple different types of speciation. And speciation can happen when populations are separated through geography or other means. Allopatric speciation is when populations are separated through geography. The bottleneck and founder's effect are going to be an example of allopatric speciation. Sympatric speciation is when the population is not able to reproduce with each other despite being in the same area. This is going to be a rarer form of speciation, but can still happen among plants with something called polyploidy. And within this example, we're going to have two species of wild wheat that mated with each other to form a new species. The hybrid is sterile due to the odd number of chromosomes, but with polyploidy, the plant was able to double the amount of chromosomes. The even amount of chromosomes will allow the plant to successfully reproduce, and this can only be seen within plants. Genetic changes do not negatively affect plants, insects, and microorganisms as much as they do larger animals. Now we'll move on to chapter 19, section 6, where we will talk a little bit about macroevolution and the evolution of humans. So within the theory of evolution, all primates have a common ancestor. Primates include prosimians and anthropoids. The primate ancestor was originally thought to live on the ground, but then the few adapted to life in the trees. These primates that gained mobile limbs and opposable thumbs. So here is a diagram showing the potential evolution of humans. So the primate ancestor was weasel-like and lived on the ground. It is hypothesized that this ancestor started living in the trees around 66 million years ago. Then the prosimians and monkeys will split off from each other about 60 million years ago. The Old World monkeys and the New World monkeys split about 45 million years ago. The Old World monkeys and apes split off about 35 million years ago. And the lesser apes, which are gibbons, and the greater apes split off about 20 million years ago. And all great apes and humans then split off about 7 million years ago, and all great apes and humans are classified as hominids. So in order to be classified as a hominin, the animal must be able to stand erect and must be able to walk on 2 feet, which is called bipedalism. Hominids include apes, chimpanzees, humans, and the closest extinct relatives of humans. Some early hominids includes S. chadenus, which was dated to about 7 million years ago. And these guys had a brain case that was ape-like, and there were suggestions of bipedalism in the fossils that were found. And then we have Ardipithecus ramidus, which was dated about 4.5 million years ago, and they gave him the nickname Artie. They only found a few skull fragments, so wasn't able to know much about the brain case size. However, they did find different bits of the skeleton, which suggested bipedalism. And the teeth they did find were intermediate in between apes and later hominids. Of the hominid fossils that scientists have found, scientists will put them in order based on the brain case size. So the smaller the brain case, the more ape-like it is, and the larger the brain case, the more human-like it is. The genus of hominids in evolutionary order includes Sahelanthropus, Ardipithecus, Australopithecus, and then Homo. So here we have the reconstructed hand and foot of Artie. The hand is similar to apes, with long fingers and a short thumb, and this will suggest a life in the trees. The foot, though, when tested, looks like it was able to bear more weight than the feet of apes today. This has led scientists to conclude that Artie started walking on 2 feet. And then we move on to Australopithecines, which could be a possible direct ancestor of humans. A full female skeleton from Australopithecines was found in Africa and was dated to about 3.7 million years ago. Scientists gave her the nickname Australopithecines afarensis and nicknamed her Lucy. Next from these fossils were a pair of footprints, which presumably were from the same species. The limbs of the skeleton suggested that they were able to hold weight, and the footprints further confirmed that this species walked on 2 legs. So here's a statue of Lucy at the St. Louis Zoo. The bottom picture is one of the fossilized footprints, and there, as you can see, there were 2 sets of footprints. With how close they are, it is assumed that this were the footprints of a parent and child walking next to each other. And then we move on to Homo habilis, and their skeletons were dated to about 2 to 1.9 million years ago. These may be the ancestor of the modern human. Their brain case is 45% larger than the Australopithecines afarensis. Their teeth are smaller, which suggests that they are omnivores. They have an enlarged portion of the brain case that deals with speech, which could potentially mean that they started talking. And there were also stone tools and artwork found next to the Homo habilis skeleton, which led scientists to think that they could have started the development of what culture means for us today. And then we move on to Homo erectus. And Homo erectus fossils have been found in Africa, Asia, and Europe. Their skeletons can be dated to 1.9 to 0.3 million years ago. All of these are similar in appearance, but there may be several different species. They're going to have a larger brain and a flatter face compared to Homo habilis. However, they're going to be much taller. They have a robust and muscled skeleton, still like Australopithecines, and they are believed to have appeared in Africa and then migrated to Asia and Europe. They were the first to use fire, and they fashioned more advanced tools than Homo habilis would have used. So it is theorized that modern humans evolved about 100,000 years ago from the Homo erectus that migrated from Africa to the rest of the world. And this is called the out of Africa hypothesis. So the dates on this picture indicate the date of the Homo erectus fossils found in these places. Homo erectus migrated from East Africa through the Middle East to Europe and then through Asia. Homo erectus ended up in Southeast Asia about 1.7 million years ago. So because all humans today are shown to have come from one pair of humans, scientists think that although Homo erectus migrated to all the different parts of the world, it is thought that modern humans also migrated to these same areas and then eventually replaced the Homo erectus there. And this could be for several different reasons, but one of those being that maybe they were able to outcompete Homo erectus for the habitat and food that was available in the part of the world they were in. Another early ancestor of humans is the Neanderthals, and these guys take their name from the German valley that their skeleton was found in. Neanderthals are going to have massive brow ridges. Their nose, jaws, and teeth protrude far forward. Their forehead is going to be low and sloping. There's going to be no chin, and these guys were eventually supplanted by modern humans. New evidence suggests that they did interbreed with Homo sapiens. They were heavily muscled with larger brain cases than Homo sapiens. They had a sturdy build, which may have helped them conserve body heat in the last ice age, helping them to make it through that. And they will be more culturally advanced than other human ancestors. They mostly lived in caves, but some may have built homes. They have a variety of stone tools, and there are suggestions of religion since they buried their dead with flowers and tools. And then we move on to Cro-Magnons, which are going to be the early ancestors of modern humans. They are going to have a thoroughly modern human-like appearance. They would have used advanced tools, and they may have been the first to use knife-like blades and throw spears. They may have been responsible for the extinction of many larger mammals, like the giant sloth, mammoth, the saber-toothed tiger, and the giant ox. They would have hunted cooperatively, and perhaps may have even created the first language. And their culture would have included art.